So real quick, hoodie pre-orders are officially live. They'll be available for 2 weeks only. So stoked on how these came out. I worked really hard and I'm proud of them. They'll be linked in the top of the description below. So how do you pick the right skate or longboard hardware? Well, for most, I would say just go to your local shop and have them size your setup and pick up a pack of hardware. But if you're like me, you like to dive a little deeper and learn more about the materials, the bolts and nuts characteristics, sizing, all that fun stuff. So that's what I'm gonna cover in this video. Now, if you're just here for the sizes, I'm gonna display them on screen right now so you don't have to watch the whole thing. And they're also listed in the full skate hardware article on our website, which I'll consistently be updating the more I learn. Okay, let's start with the hardware material. Now, I could probably make a whole separate video on the materials and finishes. You have 18/8 stainless steel, zinc coated steel, black oxide, black zinc, painted steel, and the list goes on. But for this, I'm only gonna go over stainless steel and zinc coated since I think that makes sense for most of us. One of the main benefits of stainless steel is its corrosion properties. It's less likely to rust. So why wouldn't you always use stainless steel then? Well, first, it's more expensive, but I guess if you're only buying 8 bolts for your setup, it doesn't make that much of a difference. The main issue with stainless steel, if I'm not mistaken, is that because it's a softer material, it has a higher chance of locking up. It's common for the nuts to seize, and then the only way to get it off is to legit cut it. And when you add in the chance of the grip tape adhesive mixing with the sand grit and sticking to your bolts, the chances are even greater of your hardware locking up. Now, this is not to say never use stainless steel, because if the corrosion properties are important to you, then what you can do if you use it to help prevent the nuts seizing up, take a bar of soap and rub a little on the bolt threads, and this will help prevent any seizing. Shout out to Gavin for helping me with this whole video, giving me that little technique there. Really appreciate it, dude. I'd say for most people watching this, using zinc plated bolts and nuts is gonna be the move because it offers some corrosion resistance and it's not gonna seize up. Okay, now that you hopefully have a better understanding about hardware material, let's move on to the bolt characteristics. For most setups, there's gonna be 8 bolts. Now, you're gonna be like, dude, all setups have 8 bolts, right? Not the case. Swell Tech, which is a surf skate, actually has 7 bolts, 3 in the front with the adapter and then 4 in the back. So all of this information, just take it with a grain of salt because it is pretty subjective. For 99% of setups, the standard size bolts are 1032. 10 refers to the standardized sizing set in place by ASME, and 32 refers to the thread count. So there's 32 threads per inch. Typically, you're gonna use bolts in the 1 to 2 inch range. So how do you know what size bolts to pick for your setup? The average deck thickness is about 1/2 inch. Truck base plates are an additional 1/8 and the nuts 1/4. So combined, the average thickness without a riser pad is about 7/8 of an inch. If you really don't want to measure or you can't measure for whatever reason, start with 1 inch and then add the thickness of your riser pad. So if you have no riser pad, then a rough bolt size would be about 1 inch. It's always gonna be best to get an exact measurement for your specific setup. Now that you know about the material, the bolt sizing, let's move on to the bolt drive types. The drive type refers to the pattern used on the head of the bolt. It determines what tool you'll use. Depending on what drive type you pick, it'll offer more or less torque. It's not the end of the world if you pick one over the other, but I would probably say most people are gonna have an easier time finding a Phillips screwdriver laying around over an Allen key. Phillips bolts offers less torque and has a higher chance of stripping. But for skate hardware, I don't think it's that big of a deal because you don't need that much torque. If you're someone who always finds yourself stripping hardware, then I would go for socket bolts. Another thing you're gonna wanna consider are the head types. Countersink heads sit flush while buttons are exposed. Choosing one over the other really comes down to how your deck is drilled or your riding style. If you're doing any ollies or flip tricks, then you're gonna want flat countersinks because they're gonna sit flush. But if that doesn't matter, then you should consider buttons or panheads. Now that we have the bolts covered, let's move on to the nuts. There are 3 nut sizes used for skateboards and longboards. 1032, which are the baseplate nuts, 5/16, which are the wheel nuts, and 3/8, which are the Kingpin nuts. Besides picking the material and size, you'll also want to make sure that there's a nylon ring in the nuts so that it prevents loosening over time. Okay, so what does this all mean? I'd say for 95% of people, you'll want to go for zinc plated hardware, but if you really need that extra protection against rust, then go for stainless steel. Just know it requires a little more care. I feel like I always resort to, it is pretty subjective, this stuff, and it comes down to your riding environment and your style. If you have any questions or suggestions, some things that I missed, drop a comment below.